Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into Jamestown, those crazy early years, using this really captivating retelling from the American History Tellers podcast.
It's a story packed with challenges, for sure. The settlers' relationship with the powerful Powhatan
Oh, yeah?
and that constant struggle for survival, in this new and often hostile environment.
Yeah, so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
Um, let's start with that fire, that swept through the settlement. Just days after a resupply mission arrived in January 1608. That's got to be rough, right? What can you tell us about the impact of this?
Yeah, it really highlights how vulnerable the colony was. I mean, just imagine a supply ship arrives bringing much needed relief, and then poof, almost the entire settlement's destroyed by fire just 5 days later.
5 days.
Yeah, 5. The American History Tellers episode really brings this to life, describing how the fire likely started in a settler named Samuel's cabin and quickly consumed almost everything.
Oh, wow. And to make matters worse, the fire also destroyed the storehouse.
Right.
I mean, losing all those vital supplies, that's got to be devastating.
Absolutely. It left the colonists in a really, really precarious position. They were essentially forced to rely on the very Native Americans they were trying to, establish dominance over.
That's ironic. It's almost like history is playing a joke on them. Well, this brings us to John Smith, one of the most well-known figures from Jamestown. The podcast portrays him as a complex and controversial character. How so?
Well, on one hand, he's this resourceful and decisive leader, but he was also known for his, harsh dealings with the Native Americans.
Yeah, it was a time of intense cultural clash, for
Right.
sure, and conflicting goals.
Exactly.
The podcast mentions Smith was actually captured by Powhatan just a month before the fire
Oh, yeah.
and sentenced to hang.
Yeah, he was accused of negligence and the deaths of 2 colonists, but as fate would have it, Captain Christopher Newport returned with supplies just in time to secure Smith's release.
Talk about a close call.
It's a dramatic story, for sure, and it really sets the stage for a very tense relationship between Smith and Powhatan.
So Smith's reprieve didn't really resolve those underlying tensions with Powhatan. It sounds like their approaches to leadership and interactions with the Native Americans were vastly different.
You can say that, again, Smith believed in a very pragmatic approach to securing food and supplies, often resorting to force or coercion. Some might call it ruthless.
Right.
But this directly conflicted with the Virginia Company's official policy, which at that time advocated for peaceful relations with the Native Americans, at least publicly.
Politically. Interesting. So even within the colony itself, there were conflicting agendas and approaches.
Yeah,
It wasn't a united front by any means.
not at all. And this internal conflict, combined with the cultural misunderstandings and the power dynamics at play, it created a very volatile situation.
Yeah, Jamestown sounds like a powder keg at this point. Let's talk about Captain Newport for a second. He was in charge of the resupply missions, but it sounds like his priorities might have differed from Smith's. What was his main focus?
Gold. He was convinced that the colony's survival depended on, discovering some precious commodity that could be sent back to England and appease investors.
But wouldn't establishing a sustainable colony, like being able to feed themselves and defend themselves, wouldn't that be more important for long-term success? I mean, why was Newport so focused on immediate riches?
It really speaks to the mindset of the Virginia Company and many of the early colonists. They were driven by this desire for quick profits and this belief that the New World was overflowing with riches, just waiting to be discovered.
So this short-sightedness, this focus on immediate gain over long-term stability,
Yeah.
ultimately that's going to have significant consequences for Jamestown.
Yeah, definitely. So you have Smith focused on survival at any cost, Newport obsessed with gold. And then you have Powhatan, the paramount chief of a powerful network of Native American tribes. How did he fit into all of this?
Right, Powhatan.
Powhatan was an incredibly shrewd leader. He was very aware of the English colonists' weaknesses, their internal divisions, their conflicting
He
desires.
sounds like a master strategist.
Oh, he was. The podcast describes this incident where Newport attempted to crown Powhatan in this symbolic gesture of submission to King James III.
Wait, they tried to crown him.
Yeah, they brought all these gifts, a suit of clothing, a fancy hat, even a greyhound, and then tried to make Powhatan kneel for this crown.
Seriously.
It's just a fascinating example of the cultural disconnect and clashing expectations at play.
Yeah. If you're trying to establish some kind of diplomatic relationship, trying to make the most powerful leader in the region kneel before you, seems like a terrible idea.
Right.
How did Powhatan react to this?
Well, he saw it right through the charade. He refused to kneel, understanding that it would be seen as a sign of subservience, and instead he demanded that the English come to him at his headquarters.
So he's basically saying, I'm the king here and you'll play by my rules.
Exactly.
I read that he received their gifts as tribute, but gave them practically worthless items in return, right? It sounds like he was skillfully manipulating the situation to his advantage.
Oh, absolutely. Powhatan was a master of diplomacy and strategy. He understood the English were reliant on him for survival, particularly after the fire, and he used that to his advantage.
Smart. It's fascinating to consider how Powhatan must have viewed these English colonists. Their strange customs, their relentless pursuit of gold, their internal conflicts. Can you imagine witnessing these newcomers fumbling their way through your land and having to navigate their unpredictable actions? Like, what strategies would you employ to protect your people and your interests?
It's a question historians continue to explore, but we know Powhatan wasn't a passive observer in all of this. He was actively shaping the dynamics of this relationship, playing the game, so to speak, and doing everything he could to preserve the sovereignty of his people.
So we have internal conflict among the colonists, clashing priorities, and a powerful Native American leader who is more than capable of asserting his dominance. It really does sound like Jamestown was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And remember, all of this is happening within the first year or so of the colony's founding.
It's only the beginning.
Exactly. We haven't even gotten to the really difficult times yet. Despite his resourcefulness, Smith's actions, especially his treatment of the Native Americans, started to cause major problems for the colony. He continued to explore and secure food, often through force, which went against the Virginia Company's instructions.
It seems Smith's approach, while seemingly effective in the short term, ultimately backfired.
Yeah, his disregard for diplomacy and reliance on force just exacerbated an already volatile situation. And all of this happened before the arrival of the third supply, a pivotal moment in Jamestown's history.
This third supply wasn't that supposed to be the colony's saving grace, bringing hundreds of new settlers and much-needed resources.
It was supposed to be, but it didn't quite go as planned. In fact, the events surrounding the third supply led to one of the most dramatic and challenging chapters in Jamestown's early years.
This is already way more complicated and nuanced than the simple Jamestown story I learned in school. What happened next?
Well, to understand the impact of the third supply, we need to backtrack a bit and talk about what was happening in England while Smythe was struggling to maintain control in Jamestown.
Okay, so let's unpack what was happening back in England during this time. I imagine the Virginia Company was facing some challenges of its own.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, the Virginia Company was a business venture. They needed to show a return on their investment to keep their backers happy and attract new settlers. And so far, that return had been pretty dismal.
Yeah, and John Smith's letters detailing the, dire situation in Jamestown probably didn't help much with investor confidence.
No, not at all. But despite these setbacks, the Virginia Company had a secret weapon. A guy named Sir Thomas Smythe.
Sir Thomas Smythe?
Yeah, he was a prominent merchant, a key figure in the British East India Company, and a master of persuasion. When he took over the Virginia Company, he essentially launched this massive propaganda campaign to revitalize interest and investment in the colony.
A propaganda campaign. What did that look like?
Think pamphlets extolling the virtues and potential riches of Virginia sermons, framing colonization as a religious duty, even these things called broadsides, which were these large posters plastered all over London. They really went all out trying to paint a glowing picture of Virginia.
So basically a bit of spin doctoring to downplay the struggles and hardships that Smith was reporting.
Exactly. They needed to rebrand the colony to present it as this land of opportunity, not a death trap, which, let's face it, is what it was looking like at that point. Smythe also restructured the colony's government, appointing a governor with increased authority, hoping to enforce more order and discipline.
It's interesting how they were trying to exert more control from afar while simultaneously being largely unaware of the complexities on the ground.
Yeah, that's a common theme throughout colonial history. This disconnect between the aspirations and expectations of those in power and the realities faced by those on the front lines often led to conflict and misunderstanding.
So while Smith is struggling to keep the Jamestown colony afloat, Smythe is back in England, orchestrating a PR makeover for the entire enterprise. What impact did this have on the colony?
Well, Smythe's efforts were successful in attracting hundreds of new settlers, eager for a fresh start and lured by the promise of land and riches.
The classic tale, right?
They assembled this fleet of 9 ships laden with supplies and carrying these hopeful newcomers and sent them off on what they called the third supply mission.
I can only imagine what these new colonists must have been thinking when they finally arrived in Jamestown. Talk about a reality check.
Right. They were expecting paradise, a land of opportunity. What they found was a struggling settlement riddled with disease, short on food, surrounded by increasingly hostile Native Americans. And to make matters worse, the Virginia Company, under Smythe's leadership, had shifted to a much more aggressive policy toward the native population.
That's a pretty drastic shift from their earlier attempts at peaceful relations. What prompted that?
It was a combination of factors. There was growing frustration with the lack of progress in finding gold, a desire to exert more control over the colony, and this growing sense of religious and cultural superiority among the English. They basically instructed the new governor to convert the Native Americans to Christianity, even by force if necessary, and to ultimately overthrow Powhatan.
So they were setting the stage for a major clash of cultures and a significant escalation in conflict.
They absolutely were. And just as this fleet carrying the hopes of a revitalized Virginia company set sail, a powerful hurricane swept across the Atlantic, directly impacting the third supply mission.
This has to be the story of the Sea Venture. I've heard about this. The flagship of the fleet carrying vital supplies and important figures gets caught in a hurricane and shipwrecked.
Yes, the Sea Venture was a large and well-stocked ship. It was carrying enough provisions to sustain Jamestown for a year, along with numerous passengers, including Sir Thomas Gates, the lieutenant governor, who was supposed to take temporary charge until the new governor, Lord de la Warr, arrived.
The Sea Venture was wrecked, but the people on board survived, right? Where did they end up?
Yes. Miraculously, everyone on board survived. They were shipwrecked on Bermuda, hundreds of miles off course with a damaged ship and facing an uncertain future. Meanwhile, back in Jamestown, the colonists were completely unaware of the fate of the Sea Venture and its passengers.
So you have this group of survivors stranded on Bermuda, the colonists in Jamestown facing increasingly dire circumstances, and a new governor, Lord de la Warr, on his way with reinforcements, completely unaware of the chaos that awaits him. Talk about a tangled web of events. What happened next? Did the survivors of the Sea Venture ever make it to Jamestown?
That's a great question, and the answer is a bit more complicated than you might expect. They did, but it took some time and a whole lot of ingenuity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the Sea Venture survivors, they didn't just, sit around waiting for a rescue.
What'd they do?
Well, they spent almost 10 months on Bermuda, building 2 new ships from the wreckage of the Sea Venture and whatever salvaged materials they could find.
Wow, 10 months. I bet that wasn't exactly a tropical vacation.
Yeah. No, not at all. There were internal conflicts, of course, and the need to establish some form of governance, and always that constant uncertainty of their situation. But they adapted, they utilized the resources they had available, and ultimately demonstrated remarkable resilience.
Yeah, the human capacity for innovation and determination.
Yeah.
Even in the face of, extreme adversity. So after 10 months on Bermuda, they finally set sail for Jamestown. What did they find when they arrived?
Well, they arrived in May 1610, expecting to find, a thriving colony, maybe even some news of the other ships from the Third Supply Fleet. Instead, they found Jamestown decimated. The colonists had endured what became known as the Starving Time, a brutal winter of famine and disease and constant fear of attack.
The Starving Time. It's one of those events you learn about in school, but it's hard to truly grasp the desperation and suffering those colonists endured.
Yeah.
What was their reaction to seeing the Sea Venture survivors arrive after all this time?
It must have been a mix of relief and disbelief. I mean, they assumed the Sea Venture had been lost at sea. To see these familiar faces arrive seemingly out of nowhere must have felt like a miracle.
But this reunion, as heartwarming as it must have been, was short-lived, right? Sir Thomas Gates, who was on the Sea Venture, was supposed to take charge of the colony until Lord de la Warr arrived. What did he find when he assessed the situation?
Ruin. The fort was in disrepair. The surrounding land had been depleted by over-farming relations with Powhatan, were at an all-time low, and the colonists were in terrible condition, both physically and mentally. He quickly realized that Jamestown in its current state was unsustainable.
So what did he do?
He made the difficult decision to abandon Jamestown. He ordered the remaining colonists, now joined by the Sea Venture survivors, to board those 2 ships they had built in Bermuda and sail back to England.
They were giving up on the colony.
Essentially admitting defeat.
That must have been a crushing blow to those who had endured so much, who had put their lives on the line to establish this colony. Was that the end of Jamestown?
It seemed that way. As they were sailing down the James River with heavy hearts and uncertain futures, they encountered another ship coming upriver.
This has got to be Lord de la Warr, the new governor appointed by Smythe back in England. Talk about a dramatic turn of events.
It was Lord de la Warr had arrived with fresh supplies, additional colonists, and perhaps most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose and authority. He saw colonists abandoning their settlement and essentially ordered them to turn around.
Wow, he convinced them to give Jamestown another chance.
He did. He persuaded them to return to Jamestown, promising strong leadership discipline and a revitalized effort to establish a thriving colony. Under his leadership, they rebuilt the fort, reestablished some semblance of order, and adopted a more aggressive stance towards the Native Americans.
So Jamestown, against all odds, survived. But this survival came at a cost. Years of hardship, countless lives lost, and a growing conflict with the native population.
It's a complex and multifaceted story, full of twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies. It challenges us to confront the realities of early colonization, the ambition, the resilience, the cultural clashes, and the often devastating consequences of those encounters.
It's definitely made me rethink what I thought I knew about Jamestown. It's not just a simple tale of brave adventurers discovering a new land. It's a story of complex human interactions, power dynamics, and the consequences of choices made both individually and collectively.
And it raises questions about perspective. We've primarily been looking at this story through the lens of the English colonists, but what about Powhatan and his people? Their experiences, their losses, their strategies for navigating this new and often threatening presence.
It's a perspective we often overlook in traditional historical narratives. We tend to focus on the colonizers, not those who are already here. It's a reminder that there's always more to the story, more perspectives to consider, more voices to uncover.
Exactly. And that's something I hope you, our listener, will continue to explore. Seek out those untold stories, those different perspectives, and challenge yourself to understand the past in all its complexity.
It's a reminder that history is never just a simple story. It's a tapestry of voices, experiences, and interpretations. And as we continue to learn and grow, our understanding of the past will continue to evolve. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the rich and often surprising stories that have shaped our world.